Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
I can still picture that fateful day 20 years ago when I stood at the altar in a quaint Ohio chapel, my white dress feeling heavier than it should have because the empty chairs on my parents' side screamed louder than any celebratory music ever could, leaving me to exchange vows with Mark in front of a handful of friends who clapped politely while I fought back tears that threatened to ruin my mascara, all because Robert and Linda, my own mother and father, chose some half-baked excuse about a family emergency in their Indiana hometown over witnessing their daughters walk down the aisle after I'd spent months planning every detail from the wildflower bouquets to the backyard reception under string lights that now seemed mocking in their glow. Back then, at 22 years old and full of that wide-eyed optimism you only get from scraping by in the Midwest Rust Belt, I had believed family meant showing up no matter what, especially for a wedding that represented the fresh start I desperately needed after years of their neglectful parenting that left me raising myself through high school scholarships and part-time jobs at diners where the tips barely covered bus fare. But they didn't come. Didn't even call until the next day with a voicemail that sounded more apologetic to the universe than to me, and that betrayal festered like an untreated wound, shaping the woman I became as I poured every ounce of determination into building a real estate career in Chicago that started with cold-calling landlords and evolved into flipping multi-million-dollar properties until I could afford luxuries like the $190,000 Maserati Gran Turismo that now carried me smoothly down the interstate toward their modest suburban home on this crisp autumn afternoon. Life has a way of circling back with ironic twists, doesn't it? Because just 2 weeks ago my phone rang with my mother's voice on the other end, all honeyed and hesitant as she mentioned hearing about my successes through a cousin's social media scroll, and suggested we have a long overdue family discussion now that things were looking up for everyone involved. Her words laced with that subtle probing I recognized from childhood, when she'd fish for handouts without ever reciprocating the support, and though part of me wanted to hang up and block the number for good, another part, the one fueled by years of quiet resentment, saw this as the perfect opportunity to confront the ghosts of that missed wedding and perhaps deliver a dose of reality wrapped in the shine of my hard-earned achievements. As I gripped the leather-wrapped steering wheel, the engine's low growl a constant reminder of how far I'd come from the girl who once borrowed her aunt's old sedan for dates. I couldn't suppress a wry smile at the thought of them spotting this Italian beauty parked boldly in their driveway, its sleek lines and polished chrome standing out against the backdrop of faded ranch-style houses with overgrown lawns and American flags fluttering lazily from porches where neighbors gathered for potlucks and 4th of July barbecues, the kind of community where success stories like mine were whispered about with equal parts envy and judgment. I timed my arrival for late afternoon when the sun would cast the longest shadows, making the Maserati impossible to ignore as I pulled up right in front of their address, the tires humming softly over the uneven pavement before coming to a precise stop. And for a moment I sat there idling, heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and that old familiar ache, because inside this car, secured in the glove compartment like a secret weapon, waited the real surprise I'd prepared meticulously over the past months, something tied directly to that wedding day and guaranteed to shift the power dynamic in ways they never imagined. Stepping out into the cooling air that carried hints of leaf piles and distant barbecues, I adjusted my tailored blazer, the one from a high-end boutique that screamed confidence without trying too hard, and approached their front door with purposeful strides, my heels echoing on the concrete path as if announcing the arrival of unfinished business. And just as my finger pressed the doorbell to release its insistent chime through the house, I caught a glimpse of movement behind the sheer curtains, wondering if this visit would finally force them to acknowledge the daughter they overlooked or if their sudden interest in a family discussion stemmed purely from the allure of the luxury they'd glimpsed pulling up outside, leaving me poised on the threshold with the weight of 2 decades hanging in the balance as the door began to creak open. As the door swung inward with a hesitant creak that echoed the uncertainty hanging between us like fog over a morning lake, my mother Linda stood there framed in the dim hallway light, Her face a mixture of forced warmth and barely concealed surprise that widened her eyes when she registered not just my presence, but the unmistakable outline of the Maserati dominating their driveway through the window behind her, prompting a quick glance over her shoulder before she pulled me into an embrace. That felt more obligatory than genuine, her arms wrapping around me with the same tentative grip she'd used years ago when handing over birthday cards stuffed with $5 bills, as if that made up for the emotional voids. Behind her, my father Robert emerged from the living room shuffling in worn slippers that scuffed against the faded carpet, his once broad shoulders now stooped from decades of factory shifts and unfulfilled dreams. And he nodded gruffly before extending a hand that I shook, firmly to remind him of the strength I'd built without his guidance. All of us moving inside where the air carried the familiar staleness of a home preserved in time with its walls lined by yellowed family photos that skipped over my milestones and focused on vacations they could afford only after I'd left. We settled around the cluttered kitchen table where stacks of unopened mail and half-empty coffee mugs suggested the financial strains they'd hinted at over the phone, Linda bustling to pour glasses of iced tea from a pitcher that looked as old as my grudge, her chatter filling the space with questions about my drive from Chicago and compliments on my outfit that rang hollow against the backdrop of their modest existence, while Robert eyed me appraisingly as if calculating the worth of the daughter who'd outpaced them in ways they never anticipated during those childhood evenings when he dismissed my ambitions as pipe dreams over plates of meatloaf and mashed potatoes. The family discussion they craved unfolded almost immediately, their voices overlapping in a rehearsed symphony of pride for my real estate ventures that I'd pieced together from online articles and mutual acquaintances. Linda gushing about how inspiring it was to see a girl from their little Indiana town make it big in the city, her words veiling the real intent that surfaced when Robert cleared his throat and mentioned casually how the economy had hit them hard lately with his retirement checks not stretching as far and unexpected repairs on the house piling up like snowdrifts in winter, his gaze flickering toward the window where my car sat like a taunting trophy of the life I'd forged independently. I listened with a composed smile, stirring my tea slowly to buy time as memories flooded back of that wedding day when their absence left me navigating the reception alone, fielding questions from guests about where my parents might be while I forced laughter over cake slices that tasted like ash. And it fueled the spark of revenge I'd nurtured quietly, leading me to lean forward and share a fabricated tale of an upcoming investment fund I'd been considering for family members who'd stood by me through thick and thin, watching their postures straighten with eager interest as I described potential returns that could ease their burdens if only they'd shared more about those emergencies from 20 years prior that kept them from my ceremony. The room's atmosphere thickened with their probing responses, Linda pressing for details on how much I might allocate while Robert nodded along with the optimism that bordered on desperation. But I pulled back just enough to deliver the witty sting by revealing that the fund was actually earmarked for charitable causes supporting single parents who'd sacrificed everything, a clever deflection that left them blinking in confusion before I added with dry humor that it seemed fitting given how they'd prioritized other family matters back then. The reference to my brother Jake hanging unspoken yet heavy as Linda shifted uncomfortably and mentioned in passing how he'd always regretted not making it to the wedding either due to his own troubles that pulled everyone in different directions. That offhand comment about Jake, the favored son who'd vanished into a string of failed startups years ago, stirred a fresh layer of resentment in me because it highlighted the favoritism that had always skewed their attentions away from my achievements. And as the conversation meandered toward lighter topics like neighborhood changes and old recipes, my eyes caught on a corner of yellowed paper protruding from beneath a stack of magazines on the counter, an envelope addressed in Jake's distinctive scrawl to me personally with a postmark from 5 years back that suggested unfinished business they hadn't bothered to forward. Heart quickening with the possibility of unearthed secrets that could amplify this confrontation beyond mere financial pleas, I feigned interest in helping clear the table to inch closer, but just as my fingers brushed the edge, Robert's phone buzzed loudly on the table with a call from an unknown number that made him pale slightly before silencing it. leaving the air charged with unspoken dilemmas as Linda suggested we continue outside to admire the car up close, her curiosity about what else it might hold pulling me toward the door while that envelope taunted from afar, promising revelations that could either mend or shatter the fragile thread of this reunion entirely. Stepping out into the driveway where the Maserati waited like a silent sentinel under the fading light of the afternoon sun that painted everything in warm hues of amber and shadow, my parents flanked me with Linda's arm linked tentatively through mine as if anchoring herself to the promise of something tangible amid their uncertainties, while Robert hung back a step to openly admire the vehicle's contours with a whistle that carried more envy than appreciation, his calloused hands hovering near the hood without touching as though afraid it might vanish like a mirage in the desert heat of their regrets. We circled the car slowly, the gravel crunching underfoot in a rhythm that mirrored the tentative pace of our conversation as Linda peppered me with questions about its features. From the heated seats that cradled you like a luxury hug to the sound system that could drown out the loudest family arguments, her enthusiasm a thin veil over the deeper curiosity that bubbled up when she asked if I'd brought anything special from Chicago to share during this visit, her eyes darting toward the passenger door with an intuition that made my pulse quicken because she was skirting dangerously close to the glove compartment's hidden contents without realizing the Pandora's box it represented. Robert chimed in with his own brand of probing, commenting on how such a machine must handle like a dream on the open highways stretching from the city to places like their quiet Indiana suburb where he'd spent his life commuting to dead-end jobs that never led to the stability he promised us kids. And I responded with a light-hearted deflection laced with humor by joking that it drove smoother than most family reunions I'd imagined over the years, the kind where everyone shows up on time and without excuses, a subtle jab at their wedding absence that hung in the air like exhaust fumes before dissipating into awkward laughter from Linda, who quickly steered us toward reminiscing about my early real estate days when I'd call home excited about a closing only to get voicemails in return. As we paused by the driver's side, the metal still warm from the journey, I felt the internal dilemma intensify like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. Torn between unveiling more of my success to widen the gap they'd created or holding back to let their imaginations run wild with possibilities that might lead them to reveal their own buried truths. Especially after that mysterious phone call and the envelope I'd glimpsed inside, which now nagged at me as a potential key to understanding why Jake had always been the priority, receiving bailouts for his schemes while I navigated life's pitfalls solo after they skipped not just the wedding, but countless other moments that shaped my independence. To ease the tension and deploy a touch of revenge that felt clever without cruelty, I unlocked the doors with a beep from the key fob and invited them to sit inside for a better feel, watching their faces light up like children at a county fair before I casually mentioned how the car's value alone could cover their mortgage for years if flipped right, but alas, it was off-limits for loans since I'd learned the hard way about family entanglements from past experiences like a certain ceremony 20 years back, where support was as absent as the bride's parents. The words landing with a witty sting that left Robert shifting in the leather seat and mumbling about how times were tougher. Then with Jake's troubles pulling resources in every direction, his admission opening a crack in their facade as he described how my brother's latest venture had imploded just before the wedding date, forcing them to choose between a plane ticket and legal fees that ultimately favored blood over vows. That revelation stirred a fresh wave of resentment in me, picturing Jake off in some distant state chasing shadows while I stood alone exchanging rings with Mark in that chapel, the guests' sympathetic glances burning hotter than the summer sun outside, and it made me question if confronting them fully now would bring closure, or just more layers of excuses wrapped in partial apologies, especially as Linda leaned forward from the back seat to peer at the dashboard compartments with a comment about how fancy cars often hold little treasures from the road, her words unknowingly circling the surprise I'd stashed away, the one compiled from old letters and documents that could expose the financial manipulations tied to Grandma's will they'd contested behind my back. The growing conflict simmered as we climbed out and wandered back toward the house, the sun dipping lower to cast elongated shadows that seemed to stretch our unspoken grievances across the lawn, and just as I was about to press for more on Jake's whereabouts, Robert's phone buzzed again with the same unknown number, this time on speaker by accident, a voice crackling through asking about the wedding album and the debt it represents, freezing us all in place as Linda's face drained of color, and she stammered that it must be a wrong number, but the doubt in her eyes hinted at deeper secrets unraveling, leaving me standing there with the keys to the Maserati in hand and a resolve hardening like concrete under the weight of impending revelations that promised to tip this family discussion into uncharted territory. With the echo of that mysterious voice from Robert's phone still reverberating in my ears like an unwelcome echo in an empty auditorium, we retreated back into the house where the late afternoon light filtered through the blinds in slatted patterns that striped the floor like bars on a holding cell for unresolved family sins. Linda busying herself with pulling out mismatched plates and announcing over her shoulder that we should all sit down for an early dinner to shake off the awkwardness, her movements frantic as if cooking could glue back the cracks forming in their carefully constructed narrative of benign neglect. Robert pocketed his phone with a grumble about telemarketers getting too clever these days, but the tension lingered thick as the aroma of thawing ground beef sizzling in the pan, prompting me to suggest we invite a couple of their neighbors over for what could pass as an impromptu gathering, since the street was already buzzing from the sight of my car parked out front, like a celebrity endorsement for upward mobility in a neighborhood of fixed incomes and fading aspirations. As the evening deepened with the sun surrendering to twilight hues that turned the sky a bruised purple, two couples from down the block arrived bearing casseroles and 6 packs of domestic beer, their greetings warm and laced with curiosity about the shiny addition to the cul-de-sac that had them craning necks earlier from their porches. And soon the living room filled with the chatter of small-town camaraderie where stories of high school football games and church potlucks mingled with sidelong glances at me. The prodigal daughter returned in style that whispered of lotteries won or marriages to the right side of the tracks, seizing the moment to orchestrate a bit of public revenge that felt as satisfying as a well-placed comeback at a family barbecue. I steered the conversation toward my real estate triumphs with embellished tales of closing deals on lake houses and urban lofts that had everyone oohing and awing, then casually dropped that my parents had been instrumental in my drive by teaching me the value of hard work from a young age. A white lie delivered with a wink that made Robert choke on his beer while Linda forced a smile tighter than her budget, the irony landing like a punchline in a comedy routine where the setup involved their chronic absences, including that infamous wedding day when their support meant radio silence amid my vows. The gathering hummed with laughter at my humorous asides, like comparing the Maserati's acceleration to how quickly family lore gets exaggerated over backyard grills. But beneath the levity, the conflict escalated when one of the neighbors, a retired accountant named Harold with wire-rimmed glasses and a penchant for gossip, leaned in to commiserate with Robert about mounting medical bills and the sting of Social Security not keeping pace with inflation, unwittingly drawing out confessions from my father about how Jake's disappearance had left them saddled with cosign loans for his ill-fated tech startup that tanked spectacularly 5 years back, draining their savings to the point where foreclosure notices now lurked in that same stack of mail I'd eyed earlier. Hearing the raw details of their financial woes firsthand twisted something inside me, that internal tug-of-war peaking as pity warred with the righteous anger I'd carried like extra baggage on every milestone they missed, making me second-guess the pettiness of my stage spotlight because part of me, the empathetic Midwesterner raised on second chances and community suppers, wondered if rubbing their noses in my success was just prolonging the pain for all of us, especially when Linda caught my eye across the room with a plea that spoke volumes about the sacrifices she claimed to have made by favoring Jake's dreams over my wedding flight. Yet the revenge impulse won out in a clever twist as I pulled Harold aside during a lull and whispered about a fictional investment seminar I'd hosted back in Chicago for folks in their situation, complete with success stories that mirrored their struggles, only to reveal later to the group with feigned surprise that it was geared toward debt-free applicants only, a witty exclusion that left Robert fuming quietly behind his plate of lasagna, while the neighbors chuckled obliviously. The light vulgarity of the situation hitting home as I likened it to gate-crashing a feast you weren't invited to in the first place. As the evening wound down with handshakes and promises to do it again, the guests dispersed into the night carrying Tupperware and tales of the impressive car outside, leaving the three of us in a heavier silence broken only by the ticking of the wall clock that marked time's relentless march since that chapel abandonment, and with a murmured goodnight I excused myself to the driveway where the Maserati waited cool and unyielding. But just as I slid into the driver's seat and reached for the ignition, another text pinged from the unknown number with a photo attachment showing a faded check stub from Grandma's estate made out to Jake, captioned "Time to collect what's owed before the real surprise drives away," sending a chill down my spine as headlights swept the street from an approaching vehicle that looked suspiciously like the one my brother used to drive, leaving me gripping the wheel in the dark with questions exploding like fireworks over weather. This family web was about to ensnare me tighter than ever. Gripping the steering wheel of the Maserati as the approaching headlights sliced through the enveloping night like accusatory fingers pointing toward long-buried truths that had simmered beneath the surface of this entire visit, I watched the vehicle slow to a halt a few houses down with its engine idling in a low rumble that echoed the uncertainty churning in my gut, the text image of that faded check stub from Grandma's estate burning into my mind as a stark reminder of the financial favoritism that had always tilted the scales away from me toward Jake's endless pursuits, prompting me to kill the ignition and step out into the cool evening air where crickets provided a tense underscore to the unfolding drama that felt like the final act of a play I'd been directing subconsciously for 2 decades. The car door opened with a familiar squeak that sent a jolt through me, revealing not my brother, but a disheveled figure who turned out to be Harold the neighbor from earlier, waving sheepishly as he explained he'd forgotten his jacket inside and was just retrieving it, his laughter diffusing the momentary panic, but leaving the text's implications hanging heavier than the dew settling on the lawn. So I pocketed my phone and strode back to the porch where Robert and Linda lingered under the weak glow of the outdoor light, their faces etched with a weariness that softened the edges of my resolve yet fueled the need to deliver the reckoning I'd come prepared for. We reconvened in the living room, now stripped of guests' energy and cluttered with the remnants of dinner plates stacked haphazardly on the sideboard, the air thick with the scent of cooling lasagna and unspoken confessions as I sat across from them on the sagging couch that had witnessed countless family arguments I'd only heard about secondhand. Pulling the wedding album from the Maserati's glove compartment where it had waited like a loaded question throughout the day, its leather cover worn from years of solitary perusals during quiet nights in my Chicago apartment when loneliness crept in despite the skyline views and successful closings. Flipping it open on the coffee table between us, I traced the photos of that Ohio chapel with its empty pews glaring like accusations, recounting in a steady voice how their absence had forced me to smile through toasts and dances alone, while Mark's family filled the void with awkward sympathies, the pages turning to reveal not just snapshots, but the notarized letter tucked within, its formal language detailing how they'd contested Grandma's will shortly after her passing to redirect funds toward Jake's education and ventures, siphoning what was meant for my future, including the scholarship buffer that might have eased my path beyond scraping by on waitressing tips and community college loans. Their reactions unfolded in slow motion, Robert's face paling as he recognized the document's authenticity from the lawyer's seal, Linda's hand flying to her mouth with a gasp that carried genuine remorse, mixed with defensiveness about the desperate choices made when Jake's troubles threatened to upend everything. And in that vulnerable moment, I unleashed the ultimate revenge with a clever proposition wrapped in the guise of reconciliation, offering to cover their immediate debts and even co-sign a modest home repair loan if they signed a simple waiver relinquishing any lingering claims to the estate remnants, turning their past greed into a present day trade-off that left them no choice but to confront the imbalance they'd created, my words delivered with a wry humor that likened it to finally settling a bar tab from a party they crashed without inviting the host. As they huddled over the papers I produced from my purse, prepared weeks in advance with legal advice from a firm that specialized in family disputes. The emotional twist deepened when Robert admitted in a voice cracked by regret that Jake wasn't missing by accident, but hiding out in a small Ohio town to evade creditors, still chasing the fallout from that very inheritance diversion, his schemes collapsing under the weight of bad investments that echoed the very emergencies they'd cited for skipping my wedding. A revelation that humanized them in my eyes even as it amplified the betrayal because it meant their neglect stemmed from active choices rather than mere oversight, leaving me to navigate a whirlwind of empathy clashing with the satisfaction of this witty closure. With signatures inked and hands shaken in a truce that felt more like a ceasefire than peace, I gathered my things and headed for the door. The Maserati's keys jingling like a final punctuation as I paused on the threshold to absorb the scene of my parents diminished yet oddly relieved under the porch light. Driving off into the starlit road with the album secured beside me and questions swirling unresolved about whether this act of calculated generosity would mend the fractures or merely paper over them until the next family specter arose, pondering if blood ties ever truly sever or if they stretch eternally like rubber bands snapping back with unpredictable force. The highway lights blurring into a thoughtful haze that left the ending open to whatever tomorrow's dawn might demand.